Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, this is Jeremy Smith. Today we're going to be talking about something that I think is a little bit controversial, but this is a video I have been thinking about for quite some time. Now, I was going to start out by talking about Canon and Sony. However, I didn't think that would be entirely fair. I thought it'd be a lot more helpful to everyone if I started talking about the shortcomings of the Nikon brand, because that's primarily the camera that I use myself. And I still use Sony for some purposes as well, but primarily since I'm Nikon, well, Nikon just makes more sense. Whenever I first started to get more serious in photography and decided that I wanted to get my first digital SLR, it was a camera called a Nikon D80, and that was back in about 2006. And at the time, the D70 had been out for quite a while, and Canon had just come out with the D30. Sorry, not D30, 30D. And anyways, I'd never been the world's greatest fan of the Nikon D70 for whatever reason. I just didn't really care for the camera that much. The Canon 30D just seemed like a much more advanced camera. The high ISO performance was better. But the thing is, I was never particularly keen on its ergonomics. So I could never really decide exactly what I wanted to do. But after a little bit of consideration, I was leaning more towards the Canon, but then I started hearing rumors of a Nikon D70 replacement coming out very soon, and I thought that might actually be worth waiting around for. So that's how I got started with Nikon. Now, despite all the years I've been using Nikon, that doesn't mean that I think that they're perfect. I basically just view Nikon as the lesser of all evils. So basically, they just work the best for me. And the limitations that the Nikon cameras have are not as great as some of the limitations I find in other camera systems. So that's basically how it all works out for me. Now, after my D80, I went on to own several other Nikon cameras. Since then, I've owned the D90, the D7000, the D700. And currently I own a Nikon D800 and D600. So I'm definitely not a stranger to the Nikon bodies, but a couple things that have there are a lot of things that have certainly evolved in Nikon a lot as more time has gone by. Slowly Nikon has started to overcome the limitations of the whole mechanical aperture thing. So that's why basically a Nikon, traditionally, their cameras operated the aperture control in the lens with a little mechanical lever. And that's why cameras like the D7200 today, our lower bodies, can't actually change f-stop while in live view. But as newer lenses come out, like the new 300mm f4, for example, those lenses actually have an electronic lens diaphragm, and so now we're kind of getting away from using that mechanical linkage. So these are little small things that have just been evolving in Nikon that are going to be less of an issue in the future. However, there are some big things that still persist. One of the main reasons why I like Nikon is actually because of their flash system. I am experienced with Canon's flash system as well, and while I think the new flash system with flashes like the 600EX and the new 430 model that's coming out as well, while I like those flashes because they have the ability to do they have the ability to do radio-based wireless built in. Overall, I still prefer Nikon's system. And even with that new radio-based wireless, the thing that's a downside is if you're using older flashes, you still have to use the older infrared type technology. You don't have the option of using wireless RF on those. So even with that, I think that it's certainly a step in the right direction for Canon. But overall, I still like Nikon's flash system a lot better. I have experience with it outdoors, and I find that Nikon's infrared-based firing actually works much better outdoors than the Canon system. I've also noticed that whenever you're using, say for example, you're using a model like a 7D Mark II, and you're using its built-in flash as a commander, you actually can't do high-speed sync if you're actually using that built-in flash as the commander. Now, if you're using another speed light, say for example you were using a 580 or something like that to trigger another 580 off camera, you could do high speed sync then. So those are just little small things I've noticed about Canon system. that I don't like. Now, it's not all roses and, loveliness on the Nikon side either. One thing that I find very, very confusing on Nikon's flash system is that if you're shooting in a priority mode, let's just say that you're shooting in aperture priority, and you want to change your exposure compensation, because you say, okay, well, this looks good, but I've got a little bit of underexposure or overexposure, and so you go in and you tweak your exposure compensation. The thing that's very odd on Nikon is that exposure compensation setting affects your available light and it affects the flash. So whenever you're affecting that exposure compensation, it's also dialing down or dialing up your flash as well. But then you have your flash exposure compensation, which is also affecting your flash, but not your available light. So it gets very, very confusing. And that's why for people using Nikon, I always recommend, if you're going to be using any type of off-camera speed lights, just go ahead and forget the aperture priority or the shutter priority of the program and go straight for full manual, because then you actually have proper control over your flash and your ambient light level. On Canon, it makes a lot more sense, because on Canon, whenever you go in and you change your exposure compensation, it doesn't affect the brightness of your flash. It just affects the brightness of the available light, and then the flash exposure compensation just affects the flash, which is logical. So yeah, that's kind of a downside on Nikon. The other thing for me that's a very, very big deal in Nikon is just, I won't even say image quality. A lot of people say, well, all the latest Nikon to have better picture quality. And I don't really think it's quite as cut and dried as that. I just find that the Nikon cameras give me files that I am a lot more, let's see, how can I put this? I'm trying to put this in a politically correct way. The easiest thing to say is that the Nikon cameras produce files that suit my workflow better, meaning that I do like to do a lot of editing to my RAW files. Now, I'm all about getting everything as right in camera as possible, but for the most part, my work is characterized by lots of vibrant colors, but I also like to have, some very, very, dark tones oftentimes, or a lot of times I just like to have, I like to have very, very precise exposure control over the shadow parts of my image. And so I feel like I get a lot more range out of the Nikon files. Whenever I'm processing, I can go in and I can raise my shadow level quite a bit, and still be able to preserve my highlights. This is something that suits me very, very well, because I use a lot of flash outdoors and things along those lines. And so I'm always trying to get a very, very broad amount of dynamic range in my files. So I do end up tweaking things quite a bit, and I have it pretty much down to a science how I like to edit my Nikon RAW files. Now, with Canon files, I can't really do that. Oftentimes I shoot weddings and such with other photographers, and a lot of times, if I'm shooting with someone that is using Canon, I can easily tell the differences between the files, and I always have to process the Canon files separately, because I have to do something entirely different to them, because they don't hold up to the type of editing that I do to my Nikon files. In terms of being able to raise shadow detail and things along those lines, I just can't do that with the Canon files. However, the upside of that is I do actually like the Canon files better out of camera. So if you're, especially if you're a portrait photographer and you like to do, very, very minimal editing, and you want to have very, very good skin tones, and you're not really looking for precise tone control in your editing of your RAW files and things, I feel like the Canons actually do much, much better. If you're shooting in JPEG, I feel like the Canons do much better. They just produce a better image out of camera. But yeah, it all depends on your personal preference and taste. Kind of in my sort of unscientific method of kind of looking at what cameras people shot with over the years, I've noticed that people that don't favor as much editing, that like to have a quote-unquote natural look out of camera, I've noticed that those people tend to prefer Canon a lot more. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'll go ahead and kind of show you guys the sort of thing that I typically do. This is a photograph that I shot and I used a flash, an SB900 fired into a Phoenix Luna Octabox, and so I wanted to be able to have a lot of control here. We've got a very, very bright sky in the background. We've got a subject who has a slightly darker skin tone, and so I wanted to be able to precisely control that wide range of tones in the photograph. And you can see that in the original, we have a pretty wide range of tones, but I was able to do a lot more with the RAW file. And so this is the type of thing that the Nikon sensors seem to be able to do better than what you would get out of a Canon RAW file. But once again, it's just going to be about personal preference. The other thing that I've noticed about Nikon is that, and this is not at all about the equipment, but one thing I've seen is a big downside in Nikon has been the fact that we don't really have as good of a support community. It's certainly a good thing that there's a lot of people on YouTube and such that like Nikon, because Nikon basically has an attitude like, well, we're Nikon, and you should come to us because it is a great privilege for you to even use our cameras. Be glad that we have allowed our cameras to grace your fingertips. That's basically Nikon's attitude. They're very, very elitist minded, and that's a real shame, honestly. The other thing, though, that I see as a big downside with Nikon right now has been a lot of the recent products, even though they've come out with a lot of things that have been very, very good. Cameras like the D810, the D750, all these have been very, very good cameras. But I feel like Nikon has really been rushing to market a lot lately. And I think that is the biggest thing that has got a lot of people frustrated. It makes a lot of people feel like they're beta testers. When cameras like the D750 come out and everyone's like, oh, wow, I've got this weird flare issue. Or the D600 comes out and everyone is complaining about sensor dust and so forth. So even though Nikon has done a very, very good job of handling it, it's one of those things. They certainly should have done much better about preventing that from happening on the front end, as opposed to waiting for it, as opposed to treating their customers like beta testers. So that's something too that's been very, very frustrating for me. The other thing that I see is that Nikon's product lineup in some areas, even though they've come out with very, very, very innovative products, in some areas I feel like there's still a very, very big disconnect. The biggest area where I see that disconnect is with certain camera bodies, specifically the crop sensor variety camera bodies. Now, I'm not going to say that this would be something very, very useful for me, but that doesn't mean I don't see a need for it. A lot of people still see a need for a higher end DX body that can shoot very, very fast. Now, I will say that, and of course this is just strictly my opinion. I don't think that we will see a pro level body that has a crop sensor. However, I would like there to be something closer to what the D300 used to be. And even though the D7200 is very, very close, I still feel like there should be something, there should be something a little bit closer to the higher end bodies for those that want to be able to do sports and things like that and not spend a lot of money on like a D4 or something like that. Cameras like the D750 are certainly not bad. Once you get up to around 5.5, 6 frames per second, you have a camera that's pretty capable for sports. However, because of cameras like the 7D Mark II, that may not be enough for a lot of people. A lot of people want to have something a bit faster. The 7D Mark II is, of course, 10 frames per second. And so a lot of people on the Nikon side of things are feeling a bit cheated. So I would like to see something a little bit faster for Nikon users as well. The other thing is, too, despite Nikon, and this is something that I honestly believe all the camera companies are doing at this point, they all have been kind of like saying, well, crop sensor cameras aren't dead yet. Yet somehow the products they release to support those systems seem to state otherwise. Whenever we look at Nikon, we've seen lots and lots of new primes come out We've seen the 28mm 1.8. We've seen the 28 1.8, the 35 1.8. There's the 35mm 1.4. I mean, we've got lots and lots of Nikon primes that are full frame. But we've got, let's see here, we've got the 40mm macro, we've got the 35mm 1.8, and the 85mm 3.5 macro. And let's see, what else is there? Well, that's about it, really. There isn't a whole lot of fast primes in Nikon for crop sensor cameras. It would be nice to see some wider primes, like maybe a 10mm prime, perhaps. So this is something that we just don't see a whole lot of. And of course, Nikon's lens lineup is lacking in other areas too. While they do continue to come out with exotic super telephotos, like their new 600 f4 and their new 400 2.8 and 500 f4 and so forth, not everyone has $10,000+ to drop on a lens. So it would be nice to see, something like perhaps, something like a 400 f4 or, a 400 5.6 or a 500mm 5.6 or, something along those lines, something that's going to give us a lot more reach, but not cost $10,000. So that would be very, very good as well. It'd also be good if they'd update their tilt shift lenses. Nikon's 24mm tilt shift pales in comparison to the Canon, and of course Nikon doesn't offer a 17mm tilt shift option at all. So, whenever you look at especially what aftermarket lens manufacturers like Sigma are doing with their Art series of primes, you really have to wonder what exactly is Nikon doing with their lens lineup. And a lot of that could also be said for Canon as well, but it can definitely be said a lot more for Nikon because they have a lot bigger holes in their lens lineup. Overall, though, for what type of work I do, Nikon does work best for me. But as you guys can see, Nikon is not going to be any different than any other camera company. They're certainly not perfect. I am eager, though, guys, to know exactly what you think about all this. Write me in the comments below. Tell me what you think. I'm thinking about doing a lot more videos like this in the future, just kind of sharing my thoughts on the latest developments from all the camera companies. So if you like this video, then let me know. Don't forget to subscribe. And of course, I love hearing all the feedback. That is the biggest thing that makes a difference. So let me know what you think, and we can get a nice little discussion going in the comment section. Unless you say something retarded like the Cheeto comment that I was mentioning in the previous video. Anyways, this is Jeremy Smith, signing off.